Using black is not always the best choice for shading with colored pencils. Sometimes other colors will help you control your intensity. For this demonstration, we'll start with orange. We're also going to use a red pencil. These are Prismacolor pencils. A blue pencil. We'll use black as well, just to compare to the other colors. We're going to need a white pencil for smoothing out some of our layers, and if you have a colorless blender, you can use that as well. I'm going to start with a regular number 2 pencil and just make some circles. Altogether, we'll make 4 circles. I like to start lightly and loosely, and then go back and refine the circles. You can make your circles about the size of a quarter or a 50-cent piece if you've ever seen a 50-cent piece, just a little bit bigger than a quarter. Your circles really don't have to be all that great. You could even draw eggs or olives or any other sort of roundish shape. I'm going to take a minute to refine my circles. Be sure to pause the video so that you can catch up. Once you're happy with your circles, you can use an eraser to lighten them. You can use a pink eraser, a pink rubber eraser, but I'm using a kneaded eraser, which is kind of flexible and doesn't leave eraser shavings. Just by dabbing it and twisting it a little bit on our circles, you could see that they've greatly lightened. I'll just lighten the first 2 so that we can get started with the colored pencil application. We're going to start with an orange base layer for each of our 4 circles. We want to keep this layer very light. However, I will go over this base layer in more than one direction lightly, just to smooth out the strokes as best I can. Working with colored pencils is about working with layers. There's a limit to how many layers we can apply before the paper really won't accept any more layers. So just a couple of light layers for the base coat and we're ready to shade. In order to shade, we have to have a light source. For us, on each of our circles, our light will come from the top and from the left, as indicated by the light bulb. Starting on the bottom and the right edge of our sphere, we'll begin our shadow and we'll shade in sort of a crescent moon shape, lightening our strokes as we work towards the middle of our sphere to create the impression of a round form. Orange is a light color, and so there is a limit to how dark we can get this shadow, but what we're really comparing here as we move from circle to circle, choosing a different color to apply our shadow, is a change in intensity. And we can see already building up the orange in the shadows makes for a very bright shadow, a very intense shadow. In fact, on this first sphere, the darkest part of the shadow will be where the color is brightest. Depending on your subject, that may be a good idea, but often the core of a shadow, the darkest part of a shadow, is not the brightest color or the brightest part of an object. Now where the color is light, where the orange is light, it's speckly. And in order for the lighter areas to feel as solid and as strong in terms of the application as the shadow, I'm using a white pencil to kind of mix that light orange down into the paper. You can do all of the mixing over the top of the lighter areas and even the midtones with a white pencil. You can also use a colorless blender, particularly in the midtones or in the darks. So I'll use a little bit of a colorless blender in here as well. This is an optional pencil. It's a pencil with wax for the filament that includes no pigment. Alright, so this first sphere is looking pretty solid, and we can still see that the most intense area is the darkest part of the shadow. We'll call this our monochromatic sphere because it was made with only one color, mono meaning one, and chromatic sort of referring to color or the intensity of color. Now, for the second sphere, we're going to begin the exact same way. In fact, for all three of the next spheres, we'll begin the exact same way, with an even application of orange, and then sort of make a sandwich out of our shadow color. That is, we're going to sandwich, in this case, some red between the base layer of orange and a final layer of orange that brings these two colors together. Now be careful. We don't want the sphere to feel like a red sphere. We're only adding a light amount of red in that crescent moon shape along the bottom and the right edge, lightening our pressure as we work towards the center. Red is similar to orange because orange is a mixture of red and yellow. Now we'll put the top of our sandwich on our sphere, that is the last layer or the third layer of color, again using orange, and the slightly heavier pressure with the orange pencil will mix the red color into the orange. Here the shadow is going to be darker because red is a darker color than orange, but it'll also be slightly less intense. It's still intense, it's still quite bright, but not quite as bright as the monochromatic sphere to the left of this one. Still work as though you're shading with this last layer of orange, with heavier pressure along the bottom and the right edge of our sphere and lightening our pressure as we work towards the center. On this sphere, you can get a good feeling for how the lighter values are speckly with more of the white paper showing through, and the colored pencil application feels more solid in the shadows. So again, we'll need to switch to a white pencil or a colorless blender, and using moderate pressure, work in the tints or the highlight of our sphere so that it feels harmonious. It feels as though it has just as much wax on the paper as the darker areas. Again, the colorless blender is not necessary, it's just nice to have, and I'll use the colorless blender over most of the darker areas and the midtones as well, just to help smooth those areas out. So now we can see a pretty clear difference between the first and the second sphere. The relationship between orange and red is called analogous. Analogous colors are close together or next to each other on a color wheel. So we'll call this one our analogous relationship between the shadow and the color of the sphere, orange. In the third and the fourth sphere, we'll see the greatest difference between the color of our shadow and our base layer, orange. For this third sphere, we're going to use blue. Blue is the opposite of orange. It's as different from orange as black is from white. Be very careful because it's so different and also a darker pencil. It could overpower the orange. So start very lightly on the bottom and the right edge and shade lightening your pressure so that you're barely touching the paper as you work towards the middle of the sphere. You can easily go too far with the blue. You can see the area where I've worked so far feels more like a gray than it does a blue right now, and that is because these two colors, being complements or opposites, cancel each other out. They mix to the middle of the intensity spectrum, which would in this case be gray. Orange on one end of that imaginary spectrum and blue on the other, canceling each other out almost like positive and negative numbers. Let's add some heat back into this orange sphere with our third layer, going back to orange, sandwiching the blue pigment between the base layer of orange and the final shading layer of orange. And what we'll discover with the addition of this warmer color is a shadow that is less intense than what's happening in the middle of the sphere. In this sphere, different than the first two, the midtone will be the most intense area of color. The middle values will be the most intense area of color. That's a little bit more natural. Between light and dark is where color explodes. And so the highlight will be a little bit weaker of an orange. The middle value will be the most intense area. And the shadow will be a weaker version of orange, or really it's more like a brownish orange. Brown is sometimes considered a neutral color, and so using complements or opposite colors when creating shadows, you end up with a more natural shadow. That may or may not be your goal, depending on your actual subject matter. And that's why it's important to learn to use a variety of colors mixed together to create your shadows. We'll call the third sphere our complementary relationship sphere. And just for comparison purposes, even though the shadow using the complementary color is dull and the shadow using the analogous relationship is bright, let's go ahead and use black. So the second layer, or the first shadow layer on our fourth sphere, we're going to work exactly like we did with the blue pencil. Very, very light pressure, working in a crescent moon shape along the bottom and the right edge of this sphere. And then using our orange pencil over it with more moderate pressure to mix these three layers together. The shadow is very cool, cooler than even the blue pencil. It's also quite natural in that it's a little bit more dull. Usually shadows are not as bright as the object that the shadows are on. Black can be a good choice, but it's not always the best choice, depending on your subject. All right, that sphere's looking pretty solid. We'll finish it off the same way that we did the first three, with some burnishing using the white pencil in the lightest values, the highlight. And you can use that white pencil down into the midtones as well, lightening your pressure as you go, or like I've done, switch to a colorless blender. So we'll call this one our neutral sphere, or our neutral relationship, because black is a neutral and we've used it to create the shadow on this fourth sphere. So here we can see a clear change in intensity from monochromatic to analogous, slightly duller, to complementary, dull, and then neutral, very dull, in terms of the brightness or the intensity of the shadow. The complementary sphere will be the most natural, maybe black after that. I kind of like the analogous sphere. I like that hot, bright shadow that is still bright, but more interesting than the monochromatic sphere. Using just a few curvy lines, I think I'm going to turn this one into a ball of fire, a ball of flames. Oh, it's looking really hot now. I think I'll switch to the red pencil and just put some accents in some of these curves just for variety. Since the sphere was made with the red and an orange pencil, a little bit of red helps. So the takeaway for this lesson is that when shading with colored pencils, you don't always have to use black. You can use colors that are analogous or complementary as well.